And now I shall introduce tonight's speaker. Using a case study that traces a Civil War soldier from before the war until his death, the purpose of this lecture is to focus on the records created by Union and Confederate soldiers before and after the war and where they can be found. Craig Robert Scott has authored 17 books and several articles in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, the Magazine of Virginia Genealogy, and other genealogical publications. He's the president and CEO of Heritage Books, Inc., a genealogical publishing firm with over 10,000 titles in print. A professional and genealogical historical researcher for more than 38 years, he specializes in military records, problem solving, Quakers, and publishing. He's a member of the Company of Military Historians and on the editorial board of the National Genealogical Society Quarterly. He's a former director of the Association of Professional Genealogists. He's the vice president of the APG Writers SIG, and he's been a coordinator of research tracks in the Institute of Genealogy and Historical Research at Samford University and the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy and the Genealogical Research Institute of Pittsburgh. He's currently the coordinator of the SLIG Guided Research and Consultation Track, helping students solve their brick wall problems. He is the host of the YouTube at Just Genealogy channel, and he's a recipient of the Graham T. Smallwood Jr. Award and the UGA Silver Tray Award. He became a fellow of the Utah Genealogical Association in 2014. Please join me in welcoming Craig. I will stop sharing and then you could start.
Thank you so much. Let's go there. So tonight we're going to talk about the Civil War. In order to properly deal with the Civil War, you need to understand some things. And those things are the war itself. And we live in a world where lots of people have different ideas about what the war was about. And we're not going to talk about those tonight. The organizations that participated in the war, most people just think of Union and Confederate, but there are organizations within each one of those organizations that lead you to different kinds of records. And then we're going to talk about the records themselves. You need to have a research strategy in order for it to all work for you. So that's pretty much what we're going to deal with tonight in going through a couple of case studies, one Confederate, one Union, although the Confederate one is a little bit larger than the Union one. These are both Virginians that I'm going to talk about today. So the first thing that I like to do is to look at what's available out there, especially at the county level. So in Fairfax, we have brothers and cousins. Robert Driver, who recently passed, has done several books on Augusta and Prince Edward and some other things dealing with, and we have Driver's also done a book on Confederate sailors, Marines, and signalmen from both Virginia and Maryland. There are a few regimental histories out there done by H.E. Howard, and that is a rather large set. There's a coffee shop somewhere, I think in Appomattox, that still has many of them available at a reasonable price if you're missing some. Some of them have been reprinted, and that's what this 11th Virginia Infantry is about. We've reprinted all of the Driver books that have gone out of print. But so those are the Virginia Regimental series is just this great body of work that deals with, and this isn't all of them, that deals with the Confederate regiments, and then some books that deal with artillery units, cavalry units, and then some books that deal with battles in towns during the war. The Library of Congress is an excellent place to find things on the war, as is the Army Heritage Collection online. A lot of digital photographs are available from that location, and many of them are individual. My experience is the best place to find a picture of a Union or a Confederate soldier is eBay, but that's just me. So you're going to find that most of the material that you're going to be dealing with is going to be located in the National Archives. Although there is material in state archives and state historical societies and even locally. But a majority of the material was collected by the federal government and it's available through them. And for the most part, it's now on Fold 3. Much of it is. There is a web page out there at NARA that talks about research in military records, Civil War. You'll find that some of the pieces here are especially useful, especially if you've got something other than a soldier. In other words, Navy personnel are also available that way. There are a couple of guides that I use actually all the time, and I actually love them. The one on maps I don't use very much because I was able to get a set of maps from Costco years ago. They were selling it for like $35, and basically it was the Civil War maps. But the finding aids, the Confederacy and the Union are excellent sources for me, largely because they describe material that exists outside the National Archives. And that's, in my mind, quite helpful because you never know when you're going to look for things. So there's material relating to the Virginia Conscription Office and the New York Historical Society, to give you some idea. So one of the things that's really strange in the sense of the Confederacy is that this book, the picture, is in fact not a Civil War picture. This is a picture of the Richmond Greys, a very famous Richmond unit that is on its way to John Brown's hanging. And this is a picture of them all going to John Brown's hanging, which is in 1859 in Charlestown, Virginia, now Charlestown, West Virginia. The person who is up in the corner on the left-hand side is not a member of the Richmond Greys, but he wanted to go. And because he was a famous actor in Richmond and everybody loved him, they invited him to don the uniform and come with them to Charlestown. That is believed to be a picture of John Wilkes Booth. Another source that you're going to find useful, especially dealing with Union records, although Confederate records are here also, especially if they're in a federal hospital, is the preliminary inventory of the records of the Adjutant General's Office, preliminary inventory 17. This is record group 94, the records of the Adjutant General's Office, and the finding aid to it. The finding aid on the government side has been out of print, but we at the Heritage Books probably reprinted it about 10 years ago, so it's still available. And it's something that I use quite often. Something else I use quite often is the Confederate preliminary inventory that deals with the War Department collection of Confederate records. And I found that it was not very useful the way that it was indexed and set up. So 20 or 30 years ago, I don't even remember when, well, 1991 or 94, I redid it. And the archives uses my version of their version there in the archives itself. So I'm somewhat familiar with Confederate records, having transcribed the finding aid and adding to it. There are a couple other books out there also that deal with Confederate units. There are the Compendium of the Confederate Armies by Stuart Secaucus, and they're available for all of the various Confederate states, and then also those that were not Confederate, like Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, and then Confederate units raised by the Confederate government. Many of those were raised in Richmond, and then the Indian units out in the Oklahoma Territory. There also is Dyer's Compendium, which deals with Union units, and you can find that pretty much on Ancestry if you can't find the books. So what do we need to know in order to research properly? Well, we need to have their full name. We need to have their year of birth so we have some concept of their age. It would help to know where they're born because there are many records that have place of birth in them. We want to know where they were before because we want to do census research before the war. We want to know where they are during the war, just in case they want to go home on furlough. And we want to know where they are after the conflict, because largely for pensions, or in the case of Union folk, homestead applications. And probably more importantly, we want to know the name of their spouse, because sometimes it's the name of the spouse that gets us to the records quickly when we're dealing with a pension. It's also important to know the name of a child, at least one child, the child that you probably descend from, because otherwise, why are you looking at this person? So you should also have a good handle on who the children are of the person that you're researching. Now, I always, and I do mean always, do the census research. So the person that we're looking for is the person that's the fourth name down, David Beard. He lives in Augusta County, and this is the 1860 census, and he's 16 years old. So from that, by tracking him all through the censuses, I'm able to find out that he's David W. Beard. He's 16 in 1860, so he's born about 1844. His place of birth is Virginia. And his residence before, during, and after the conflict, well, I haven't included them all here, but in 1850 and 1860, he's in Augusta. By 1910, his family is in Broad Run, Loudoun County, Virginia, and his spouse's name, according to the census, is Betty. So what side do we expect to find him on? Well, he's from Virginia, so he's going to be more than likely a Confederate, although that's not always the case. There are a few Union companies up in Loudoun County that are actually on the Union establishment, and then there's some independent companies in the Valley. It's very possible in some places, especially Tennessee and Kentucky, for people to be on both sides at different times. But you pretty much have to know what state they're in order to differentiate your guy from anybody else. The units on both sides are very similar. There's an army, their corps make up an army, divisions make up corps, brigades, usually there's 2 or 3 in a division, regiments, there's 2 or 3 in a brigade, companies, they start out with 10, but the number tends to decrease over time. So you want to know what kind of service they actually had. Are they in the Home Guard? Are they militia? Are they those independent companies I was talking about? There are state units. There are volunteer regiments. These are the ones on the Confederate establishment or the Union establishment. There are units raised by the federal government, and there are units raised by the Confederate government. And both sides have sailors and Marines. You also want to know whether if the person was an officer or not. If they're lying, that's one thing, but if they're staff, they're usually additional records. So there are additional records about surgeons, engineers, chaplains, and ordnance officers. You also might know whether they were enlisted or not. There are also separate records for hospital stewards and for ordnance sergeants. And then there's the other. You could have teamsters, hucksters, laundresses, wagoneers, those kind of people. And one of the issues you're going to have to deal with is if you have a teamster who's in the Army, he's entitled to a pension. He's just been temporarily assigned duty as a teamster. If you've got a teamster who's under contract with the quartermaster corps of either side, he's not entitled to a pension. Yet some of them try to apply. So if you're a civilian doing a teamster's job, you're not going to get pension. If you're a military person doing a teamster's job, you are going to get a pension. Or you might qualify for a pension. Now, regular Army officers can be found in Heitman's Historical Register and Dictionary of the United States Army, 1789 to 1903. This is available in book form. It's available on Google Books. It's available on Ancestry. It's available on Fold3. It's also available on my laptop because I use it often. And the kinds of information that you're going to see are the name, the state of birth, the state of appointment, their military history, and their death, if it's known. So here you can see Robert Edward Lee, born Virginia, appointed from Virginia, cadet in the military academy, and then it takes him all the way through his death in 1870. You're also going to find in Heitman a list of those of the U.S. Army who left the service of the United States after 1 November 1860 and joined the Confederate Army. So this is the list of those officers that were in the Army that eventually would end up being in the Confederacy. You want to know information about captains, colonels, generals, those kind of things, because they may be writing about it, whereas what they were doing, whereas your guy may not. You want to know what battles your ancestor was in, because there are lots of books about battles. You want to know if he survived the war, because there might be a pension. And you want to know if he's a prisoner, because there might be prisoner records. So we can look at, this is Captain Henry T. Owen. He's a captain in Company C of the 18th Virginia Infantry, and he looks at the war through the eyes of a Confederate captain. This is Robert Enoch Withers, who's the colonel of the 18th Virginia Regiment. He's from Wytheville, and he also writes a book about the war. So here we have the war through the eyes of the head of the regiment, the colonel. As I said, there are books about battles. This book out of the H.E. Howard series is on the Second Battle of Winchester. There are some battles like Manassas and Winchester, they were fought over, the ground was fought over more than once. And then Kernstown is just outside of Winchester. So what are the first steps that you're going to deal with? Well, I'm always going to look to see if I have a relative who's a member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, or a relative who's a member of where somebody tells me he was in the GAR, or what I did was I asked my father and I asked my mother. And of course, my father was able to tell me every Union soldier there ever was in the family, collaterals and otherwise. I'll tell you a different story at the end of the session. But so he gave me a leg up on his grandfather, who was a Union soldier from Company E, 71st Illinois Regiment. My mother made it clear to me that her great-grandfather was in the Home Guard in Richmond, but that his son was a molder and was working in the foundry at Tredegar and then at the foundry in Lynchburg making cannon, so he was not in the infantry. So there were all kinds of sources. My grandfather used to point to a sword that was hanging on the wall, but he would never let me take it down off the wall to look at it. That sword is sitting 3 feet from me. I brought it back from Richmond last night, and I'll show it to you at the end so you can see that it's actually not a Confederate sword. But it does have my great-grandfather's name engraved on it. So the first place you're going to look is family sources. Now, if you're really lucky, you're going to find a photograph. And I have more photographs of Newton Hawes Kingman than you can imagine. He was a captain of Company I of the 13th Wisconsin Volunteers. So look for photographs, because the Civil War is a time where photographs existed. You may also find that there's a pistol or a musket or a rifle or a Sharps rifle or something, a sword, that may also be in the family. This is one that Jonathan John Baker of Stanton used during the Civil War, and he was a private in the 5th Virginia Infantry, Company D, the Southern Guard. And it turns out that David W. Beard was in Company D of the 5th Virginia Infantry, so we're going to be talking about the 5th Virginia Infantry a lot today. One of the first places I'm going to go, not that I trust it very much in its completeness, I don't think it's complete, but the Soldiers and Sailors database created by the National Park Service. There's also one of these for the Mexican War, which is actually worse. And you'll notice that there's that picture again from the Valentine Museum of the Richmond Grays headed for Charlestown. Not a Civil War picture. Anyway, when we search for soldiers in this database, if we go and look for David Beard, and we select Virginia and we select Confederate, we find that in fact there are 5 David Beards in the Confederacy from Virginia. David E, David M, David S, and David W. Well, we know from the census that our guy's name is David W. Beard, so there's a good chance that this is our David W. Beard. So we have the 5th Virginia Infantry there. So we can go and look at what the history of the 5th Virginia Infantry is. Now, we can do this in multiple places. We can do it here, the National Park Service, and we can do it on Ancestry. We can do it in Sarcophagus's book. You want to do a combination of all of them, actually, to try to spread it out and get a good picture of from everybody's perspective about what was going on. The 5th Virginia Infantry also has a Wikipedia page. So I would look at the Wikipedia page and see what it has to say. I would specifically pay attention to the references because it may lead you to specific books about the infantry regiment. And of course, the world would not be complete unless there was a Facebook page for the 5th Virginia Infantry. And there is a Facebook page for the 5th Virginia Infantry. Doesn't have very many viewers, but it is there. The other thing you want to do is when you're in soldiers and sailors database, you can get a list of all 2,711 people who were in the 5th Virginia Regiment. But I'm specifically interested in those who have the last name of Beard. And in Company D of the 5th Virginia Regiment, there are 7 Beards. There's David W., a private, out of private. There's James E. Beard, a private, then John W., a sergeant, Samuel Beard, a private, Thomas Beard, private. I'm going to be looking at all these people as family members and see how these people are, in fact, related to David W. Beard. Just because you want to do more than straight hatch, match, and dispatch genealogy, you want to flesh the families out. Now, another thing you could do is you could go and find the reenactment unit. And this, in fact, is the 5th Virginia Company D Southern Guard Civil War reenactors. And the only thing I have to say about them is that they're much heavier than I would expect them to be as Confederate soldiers. Now, this unit is, I believe, in Indiana. Outside, their members are from, Indianapolis, Trafalgar, Richmond, Terre Haute, and Moravia. So this actually is an Indiana unit that reenacts the 5th Virginia Company D Southern Guard. So far, we've got a weapon from Company D, and we've got reenactors from Company D. So having gone through the Soldiers and Sailors database, I've got some idea about what unit they belong to. Now, I'm probably going to do compiled military service record work on Confederates, whereas with Union soldiers, I would do pension work first and then compiled military service records. Because the Union pension will tell me what unit they were in. We don't really have that same opportunity with Confederate pensions, but only because there's so few of them, comparatively speaking. So I might start with the compiled military service records. I know his name is David W. Beard. I know how old he is, and I know what unit he's in based on the Soldiers and Sailors database. And I'm fairly confident I've got the right guy, especially given all the beards, especially since when I look at Company D, I find it's raised in Augusta County. So I'm pretty sure I got the right guy. So I'm going to go find the compiled military service records. There is a reference information pamphlet number 109 that if you visit the archives, I would recommend that you pick up a copy of it. It is a great reference. In my mind, it's one of the better reference information pamphlets because it's useful. However, recognize that this is not a photograph of Civil War soldiers. This is a photograph of Spanish-American War soldiers sitting here. But that's only to understand the context of the military service records. The actual service records for all Confederates that have compiled military service records can be found on Fold 3. So you would select Civil War, and then you would go and look for the Civil War service records, and you would basically pull them out as Confederate or Union. So when you look at the Confederate records, they are by state. You'll notice that there is something called CSA there. These are units raised by the Confederate government. The niter battalions is a good example of, you saltpeter and niter, you need to make gunpowder. So there were niter battalions. In Georgia, there were some salt battalions. There also is a category called officers. Those are the people that are in the corps and armies above the brigades. So they aren't associated, corps and armies are not associated with single states. So that's where they're likely to be found. They aren't just officers, they're also enlisted people there among those individuals. So when we go to the 5th Virginia Infantry and we look at the letter B, we see a whole bunch of beards, a lot more beards than we saw in the soldiers and sailors. But there is David W. So when we look at his envelope, we see David W. Beard, Company D, 5th Virginia Infantry, in a private, out of private, or some. It's not clear to me whether that's in a private, out of private, or highest rank held. But anyway, he is nothing more than a private that I'm aware of. There are some numbers along the side. They don't mean anything. I'll show you what they represent in a second. The number 216 at the top, he is the 216th person in the file of that regiment, that company of the 5th Virginia Infantry. And that's just there to provide filing assistance. And if you look farther down, there is a number of medical records and number of personal papers. You'll see the number 1 there. So there's a personal paper. Now, these are on Ancestry and these are on Fold 3. I prefer to use Fold 3 to get to them because they seem to be a lot clearer. And what you'll find in that envelope is company muster rolls, payrolls, hospital cards, those kind of things. Wherever you see the word over, and you can barely see the word over there among all that writing at the bottom on the right-hand side, you're going to want to turn it over and make sure that you've got everything. In other words, don't just do the front of the card. Make sure that you go to the next image and do the back of the card. That number that's on the front of the envelope matches the number on the back of the card. There's a serial number associated with each card in the entire collections that makes it unique. And we can see from looking at this, this was actually a late card, May 14th, 1913. They quit working on these just before World War One. They finished them just in time for World War One to happen. The Confederate cards were in fact done later than many of the other cards. And I have a whole talk somewhere on compiled military service records where I talk about what dates they started the Revolutionary War and Civil War, the Confederates, 1812 and that kind of stuff. So we have muster rolls. What I recommend that you do with all these cards is that you transcribe them into a timeline so you know where the guy is on a specific date. This is an envelope that's in his file, and it's a prisoner of war record. And this is the personal paper that the front of the envelope describes. So this is the provost marshal. He's got a parole. So he would carry around this piece of paper with him on his return home or his going to Point, City Point, to be exchanged. There would be a paddle boat. The USS New York is one of them that goes between City Point and Camp Parole in Maryland, outside of Annapolis, that's constantly moving back and forth, exchanging prisoners. If you're paroled, you can't fight. If you are exchanged, you can. So here he's in Chimborazo. This is a hospital in Richmond. If since most of you live in Richmond, you should know where Chimborazo is. There's a national park up on top of that hill. If you don't know, if you look at the Confederate monument in Choctaw and look past the monument at this rise, that rise is where Chimborazo was. So Beard was here in Chimborazo as a nurse for a period of time because he was unfit for field service. So basically he was on light duty. he goes to the hospital, he's sick, then he gets better, but not better enough. So they make him a nurse and he works there in the hospital. You'll see other kinds of records here. This is his detail. And then here he is in the hospital muster roll for Chimborazo, also as present with debility since 1 July 63. There also is some other paperwork in here. This is his pay due. This is a letter about his furlough. And this is him being detailed to duty at Chimborazo. So there's all kinds of stuff that you can find in these compiled military service records. And this is his clothing receipt roll from General Hospital number 24 and from Chimborazo. So there is on Ancestry a Civil War collection, and when we look at it, we see that there is information about the 5th Infantry of Virginia and when it was organized, when it was mustered out. And then there's a list of soldiers that takes you to pretty much soldiers and sailors. There's information. There's after battle reports. You can go also look at the various battles that the unit was in. You can also find maps. So this is a map on fold 3 from the Second Battle of Winchester. Now, a lot of the battle sites have National Park Service military parks associated with them or battlefields. A joke that used to circulate in the National Archives 30 or 40 years ago was a person stood up in the archives and asked, how is it possible that they were able to range all of these battles in national parks? I'm not going to comment further on that. So if you can find that there is a National Park Service site associated with the battle, there also may be a state park site associated with the battle. You want to check those out. Most of them have websites. I also find that using E.B. Long's book, Civil War Day by Day, and Almanac 1861 to 1865 is very useful because the compiled military service records usually will just tell you wounded and a date. They won't tell you what battle it was in, or POW, a date. They won't tell you where they were or whatever. So this is the kind of information that you're going to have. This is the Battle of North Anna River. So because it's named after a geographic point, like a river or a run or a creek, it was a Northern victory. Had it been named Hanover Junction, Jericho Mills, Jericho Ford, or Jericho Bridge, or Taylor's Bridge, it would have been a Confederate victory. And you can tell generally, not all the time, like Gettysburg is an exception, because Gettysburg is a Union victory, but it's named after a town, and towns are what you name Confederate victories after. The best example early on the war, there are 2 battles in Manassas. They're both known as First and Second Manassas because they were Union victories instead of the Battle of Bull Run. Excuse me. That's another example of. So Bull Run is one name, Manassas is the other. So they were Confederate victories. So they're named Manassas. Sorry for my confusion. I confused myself. So both battles of Manassas were Confederate victories. That's why they're known as Manassas instead of Bull Run. It would have been interesting if the Union would have won one of them, and we would have had a battle of Manassas and a battle of Bull Run. Anyway, there are lots of books about battles. This one deals with the Battle of North Anna. You also want to look for unit histories, and I've talked about those already. The H.E. Howard series. Harold Howard spent a lot of money and a lot of effort in finding authors and getting them to write, and he made some really pretty books. And this is the one on the 5th Virginia Infantry. And it's also pieces of it may be available out there. The 5th Virginia Infantry is written by Lee Wallace back in 1988. And you may be able to find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books of Maine, or somewhere else like that. If you're looking for a driver book, Heritage Books has reprinted recently all of the driver books. You might want to look for diaries and letters. There are lots of books out there that are Civil War diaries, Civil War letters. We have a book that talks about the letters written by Union soldiers home before they died in battle. Every single one of these letters was written by a guy who was killed in battle. There is James Beard. James E. Beard was a 38-year-old farmer from Augusta County who was in the 5th Virginia Infantry in Company D. And he has a diary that deals with the engagements at Manassas and Winchester. And his work as paymaster for Company D. His diary ended in 1862 when he was wounded in the Second Battle of Manassas. After the war, he returned to farming and died in Augusta County in 1906. There also are prisoner of war records. There is a roll of prisoners of war at Point Lookout. This is what it looks like in Ancestry in the select prisoner of war records. This is what it looks like, the typescript, which has been redone many times. One of the original Confederate soldier CDs from Borderbun was in fact this. These are just people who died in Civil War hospitals or Civil War prisoner of war camps. So one of my favorite people here is the second name here, Samuel S. Robinson in Company G, the 16th North Carolina. He's buried in the mass grave there at Point Lookout. He was left behind when everybody at Point Lookout who couldn't be left behind went to Elmira, a much more terrible place than Point Lookout ever was. His descendant, Royce McNeil out of Charlotte, I helped get a tombstone for him, and the tombstone got dropped off in their driveway, and they carted it up in their station wagon to the top of a mountain in North Carolina, where Sarah, his wife, was buried. So it's a cenotaph, folks. So again, archives.gov, there are lots of things there that I haven't really talked about that deal with applications of former Confederates for presidential pardons, the amnesty papers. There are Confederate papers relating to citizens or business firms, and there's the Southern Claims Commission. And those things are on Ancestry and they're on Fold 3. So you may find oaths of amnesty. This is Jacob Potterfield, who is a person living in the German settlement in Loudoun County up in Lovettsville, and he takes the oath of allegiance so that the Union Army will leave him alone. You can find the business and citizen files on Fold 3. This is my great-great-grandfather Benjamin Poitras of Petersburg, who's providing 5 dozen eggs to a surgeon in charge at the Lawn Hospital. This is the only record I have of B. Poitras during the Civil War. He's a huckster in Petersburg. At that time, he dies in 1867, so he's actually pretty old by then. Now, the Southern Claims Commission Master Index is on Fold 3, as are the barred, allowed, and disallowed claims. Basically, these were claims filed by Southerners in Southern states for depredations by the Union Army when they felt they had supported the Union. So there are approved claims for Alabama, Georgia, Virginia, and West Virginia. That's because those local state societies paid to have those filmed. And then there are the approved claims for everyone else that Fold 3 filmed later. So approved claims meant that they were successful in their claim with the U.S. Court of Claims to get money from the Claims Commission because they were able to demonstrate that, in fact, they had been damaged in some way and that they were loyal Unionists. Barred claims meant that we could prove you were a Confederate. So nope, we're not going to give you any money. Disallowed claims were basically, we can't prove you were a Confederate, but you didn't provide us sufficient documentation to account for what was taken from you. So therefore it was disallowed. Now, the other kinds of things that you will find are the Confederate pension rolls, veterans, and widows database. So let's talk about Confederate pensions. So Confederate pensions are by state. There's no real consistency across states because they're all created by state laws. You applied for a pension from the state in which you lived at the time of application. So you could have served from Virginia, but lived in Oklahoma and applied from Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma and Kentucky and Maryland also had Confederate pensions. They also had state homes. The purpose of the pensions were to deal with indigent or disabled people or widows without support. All of them from all of the states are available on Family History Library microfilm. Louisiana was the last holdout. There are many states have them online. There is a page at the national at NARA.gov in the National Archives by state that will allow you to get to whatever is available there. So, for example, Kentucky has a Department of Confederate Pensions from 1912 to 1946, and the records are there by date, name, and application number and unit. And the various, they're basically the kind of questions they ask and that kind of stuff. Virginia's are online under Confederate pensions in the digital collection. So there are images, and when we look for David W. Beard, we find one for Betty, his wife, in 1902. And there are 3 pages. And basically here we see Betty getting a pension as a widow of a Confederate soldier. She lives in Sterling in Loudoun County. The application includes information from the local Confederate veterans camp, people talking about the character of David's service and that kind of stuff. And here's the first place where we learn that David's middle name is actually William, because we don't find that anywhere else. There also is available a Virginia pension roster by year. The only place that I've seen this, I think I've seen it in the Library of Virginia, but I know that I've seen it in the Thomas Welch Library. I think that's where this actually came from. You can tell when somebody dies by whether there's a funeral expense or not. You can also tell whether soldier is dead or not because you can see an obviously female name, and that's the widow drawing her pension. Artificial limbs. Prior to the Civil War, there were few limb companies. Most of the limb companies that will exist after the Civil War are actually created by amputee veterans. So in the Confederacy, the program was by state. Virginia's are online, North Carolina and South Carolina, the records are in their state archives. So there is, there's a research note, number 14, that you can download from the Library of Virginia that deals with some of the pieces of this stuff. There are also online at the Library of Virginia, Virginia Confederate pension rolls, Confederate disability applications and receipts. These are the artificial limbs. The index to Confederate rosters, the index to Virginians who served in the Confederate Navy, and an index to Confederate Veteran Magazine. I love the index to Confederate Veterans Magazine because of all the UDC chapters that are named after Confederate veterans who have advertisements in them. So when we look at the artificial limbs and we go to the Confederate disability, is where they're located. And here's an application for artificial limb commutation. Basically, it's a payment. You go and get the limb, and then you get sort of reimbursed for it. There are some ledgers that describe the name of the individual, the regiment they were in, what they lost or what was amputated, and then what battle that occurred in. This is the list for Loudoun County. So let's talk about the Union. So the compiled military service records are on fold 3 for Union units in Confederate states, the galvanized Yankees, the 6 volunteer regiments, the border states, and small population northern states. So you will not find Wisconsin, New York, Massachusetts in the compiled military service records. You can tell by looking at fold 3, it'll have the word index, and that will let you know that you have to get it from the National Archives. These compiled military service records came from descriptive books, muster rolls, payrolls, that kind of thing. If you ever have a chance to touch one of the actual records, you will be very lucky, because it just doesn't happen very often. So this is Samuel Means. He's a captain. He's in the Loudon Rangers. When you go and look at him in the Soldiers and Sailors database, you find details about him, Union, Company A, captain. He will turn out, by the time it's all said and done, to be a major, running both companies. And he got a new headstone recently from the VA. He's buried in Loudon. This is his compiled military service record when he was with Company A, the Loudon County Rangers. And you see he has 8 personal papers, and he's got some record and pension office stuff also. That's what all those numbers are down at the bottom. So when we look at Union records, you also see CSA. Well, those are the 6 volunteer regiments, the galvanized Yankees who went west and fought the Indians. And you see, if you look at Connecticut, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, they are only index cards. They are not the compiled military service records themselves. You may be able to find photographs. This is a reunion of the Loudon Rangers. I don't know who is who, but that's a picture of them. There are other kinds of material in compiled military service records: prisoner of war memorandum, enlistment papers, casualty sheets, medical records, discharge certificates. This is what a memorandum looks like. This is James Scranton, who's a Union soldier who dies at Salisbury Prison in North Carolina. Also in his record is a casualty sheet for him dying in Salisbury, and then one for him being wounded at the Battle of Winchester. Also available in these records sometimes is an enlistment. This is for Morris Schwartz, and it is a volunteer enlistment. This is actually James Scranton's volunteer enlistment. And this is Daniel Lynch's substitute volunteer enlistment. In other words, Daniel Lynch is substituting for someone else. Here we see also in fold 3 our final statements that cover the period 1862 to 1899. These only deal with people who die in the service. So the 1899 people are Spanish-American war people. So we will have a record of death and interment, a statement of personal effects. What they would do during the Civil War is they would sell all of the personal effects and send the money home. And these are originally located in Record Group 94. They're there as final statements, or they are also there in Record Group 94, Entry 94 personnel papers. The ones in the personal papers are not included in the final statements that are on Ancestry or Fold 3. And this is what one looks like. Basically, it's a list of what's due the soldier and what's due the United States. You may also find an inventory of personal effects, and then the record of death and interment, which basically says where the guy is buried. In personal papers, that's Entry 94 of Record Group 94, the records of the Adjutant General. You will find descriptive lists, orders, assignment cards, reports of physical examination, certificates of disability, discharge, final statements, and medical records. Usually they're found in personal papers jackets inside the compiled military service records. You will find, this is Daniel Lynch's hospital card from General Hospital Camp Parole in Annapolis. And this is one of the few places where next of kin are identified. Unfortunately, the next of kin identified here is Mrs. Lynch. And Mrs. Lynch lives at 17 Trafalgar Square, London. I went to London once and I walked all around Trafalgar Square. I never could find 17, but I know I walked in front of where her house must have been at some point in time. You also may find medical descriptive lists. These are reports of medical hospitalization. You may also find hospital autopsy reports. I believe you're doing really good genealogy if you know how much your guy's spleen weighed when he died. That said, there are carded medical records. Now, the carded medical records for Confederates are included in the compiled military service records. They are not included for Union soldiers, so therefore you will have to go and get those separately. I have a YouTube channel video that talks about carded medical records if you're interested. I also have one that deals with the medical and surgical history in the War Rebellion. This is a 3 to 5 volume, depending on how it was printed, surgical history, and you will find information at the case level on individuals. So this is Sergeant J.A. Headley from Company B of the 15th Kentucky. He's 22. He was wounded at Chickamauga in 1863. And this goes through the various things about his care, and it identifies him as an applicant for a pension. And then some of them blur together. There are medical illustrations. This is one for a Confederate. You will find Union, Confederate, and civilians in these records. You can get, these are available for download from the National Institute of Health website. Just type in medical surgical history, War of Rebellion, and it will show up. There are 6 PDF files that you can download. I recommend that you do that and you go see if your ancestors identified. Here you will find them identified by cases. This for Gatewood tells us about his surgeon, and it says PACS, that's Provisional Army of the Confederate States, and he's a surgeon. And then we'll talk about how there's a urosyphilis inflammation that subsides, the wound is healthy, and he continues to improve, and then he dies, which is fairly typical. Improvement always comes before death. You'll also find that they may not have a complete case history for a guy, but they may be included in any of the various tables that will identify the man, the rank, the unit, the age, and then what the injury was. And these are sorted by injury. So this is a list of all the people with amputations of the thigh after they were shot with a flesh wound. And here's a civilian, and here's an engraving that is included with Albert McGee, who's a Negro refugee, about 30 years old. And here is the actual photograph of what the engraving is from, which is also in the book. There are court-martial files for Union soldiers from 1808 to 1939. My own great-grandfather, I have a court-martial for from 1907. If you're looking for a court-martial for a Union soldier, contact me. I have a database of all of the stuff. Otherwise, you'll have to look at 3 rolls of microfilm for the Civil War. So we've talked about family sources, we've talked about pension research, we've talked about compiled military service records, and we talked about state and local history, sort of, for Confederates, but they're a little bit different for Union soldiers. I always look for the state adjutant general's office records. And when I did that for the 13th Regiment of Wisconsin Infantry, I found a Benjamin Parrish of Sugar Creek in the Veteran Reserve Corps, absent sick at mustering out of the regiment. And he joined in 1861. He is my great-great-grandfather that my father did not tell me about. So he was unaware that he knew his great-grandfather served, but he was unaware that his great-great-grandfather had served. So Benjamin Parrish also has a pension. So it's kind of embarrassing. And I learned this 30 years after I started doing military research. I was not a very happy camper a couple of years ago. So you want to go ahead and look and see what's on the web. 13th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry has a website. That's where I got my first Newton Hawes Kingman. If you go down and look at Company I, that's where I got my first photograph of him. I have many for many more, I should say images. I don't have the actual photos, because I visited with a cousin in northern Illinois who had 8 pictures of him. And so I have 8 scans of pictures of Newton Hawes Kingman, who is Cornelia Kingman's brother, and Cornelia is Benjamin's wife. You want to look for Civil War battle flags on both sides. This is the 13th Wisconsin's battle flag. There is something called the Making of America, Cornell University Library, that if I always go this way to get to the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, but it leads you basically to Hayden Trust. But I like using the Cornell University interface better. There also are the official records of the Union and Confederate navies. I did talk about the Compendium of the War of Rebellion by Dyer, and it's on Ancestry. And this is what the 74th Regiment of Pennsylvania Volunteers looks like. You'll also find regimental histories in the Library of Congress reading room, and they are sorted by state. So you can just click on the state and see what there is. You will also find diaries and letters. And these, proud to say I'm a Union soldier. Those were the last letters home that I was talking about. And then this one is the Civil War letters of Captain Marsh that we've also published. But there are lots of these out here from a variety of different publishers. So normally I do the pension research first. I care about pension law, but for the Civil War, it's crazy. There are like 600 laws. The pension application files you should probably by now be familiar with. There are pension office ledgers. I've only gone after a couple of them. They're hard to get to. My grandfather, William Franklin Scott, was in the Chicago pension agency, so I went looking for it. There are pension vouchers somewhere. There are last and final payments somewhere. Don't know where. Sometimes a final payment will appear in a pension. There are other settled accounts, and there definitely is pension office correspondence. There are 3 pension indexes. The general index is on Ancestry, the organizational index is on Fold 3, and the numerical index is in both places. The general pension index looks like this. This is one for Seneca Phyllis that I'm using. It's on Ancestry. This is what's for what it looks like on Fold 3. Notice the word dead there. They don't have those on the Ancestry ones. That's how I know I'm in the right place. Sometimes you'll get a date of death on those. If we go and look at Seneca Phyllis for the organizational chart, you'll see that the numbers don't match. And there are 2 different numbers. The number in the organizational index is the correct number to order the pension. So I always look at both of them, because the organizational index is the right number always, but the organizational index does not include the name of the widow. So that's not very helpful. So look at both. And there's another reason for looking at Fold 3. And that reason is that they put together all of the people in that company in one place. So you can look at the pension index cards for everyone in that company, in that unit, in that regiment, in that state. The numerical index is a list of all the cards, of all the pension numbers for all the wars. So there's no relationship between any name, the people on this card, except they have the same pension number. So all these people have a pension number 504. Now, if this were Mexican War, you could use this because the Mexican War index is not online, and you can use these cards to get the Mexican War numbers. This is my great-grandfather, William Franklin Scott's Civil War pension index card. His wife's name is Melissa. There are 11 William Scotts in Illinois. Only one of them has a wife named Melissa J. He's in Company E, 71st Illinois Infantry. And the way that they file these is by the lowest number to the right. Well, he's got an XC number. That means that his file didn't end up in the archives right away. It was in the VA for a while before it finally came over. If there's no XC number, that means it came over in the first succession. If there is an XC number, that means it came over later. If it just says C, that is a much later file. On the 2nd of August in 1969, I touched this record for the first time. And this is a medical affidavit where John O. Scott, the physician signing it at the bottom, is saying, I have known this man all of my life. He is my son. Thought genealogy was going to be easy. Also in the pension file, there is a Melissa J. Scott signing an affidavit in Effingham County. That's the witnesses are Nina Austin and Etha Mikeward. Those are her daughters. Always try to figure out who the witnesses are and their family relationship. Generally, you will find that there is a list of children. Sometimes it's just children under 16. Sometimes it's all the children. So here is Melissa identifying all of her children. And my grandfather, Worley T. Scott, born 11 July 1881, is listed there. So I know I've got the right pension. Now, there are some Civil War pensions on Fold 3. They are the widow's pensions. And as of today, even only about 21 or 23% have been done. That's because they moved over to the War of 1812 stuff and started working on it. And it's almost done. Maybe they'll get back to Civil War widows at some point. There also is something out there called Pension Office Correspondence. This is the record of Pension Office. There's an index to these records on Fold 3 and, on Ancestry. It may be on Fold 3 now, but I know for sure it's on Ancestry. The cards look like this. They're alphabetical. And you want to look for these because this is the most untapped source of Civil War history that you're ever going to find. Now, my William Franklin Scott's was located in his pension file. It wasn't in a separate file, but basically he told me he guarded trains in Kentucky during the war. There are also in these records, in the record of pension officer, applications for Medal of Honor new rosettes, and this is in the 1890s. And this one is for a man by the name of Stacy. I've done a YouTube video on this guy and his Medal of Honor history. He got the Medal of Honor after the war. He gets the medal and then he applies for a new rosette. And I also go into the Medal of Honor Society and how you can track these people down. This guy's from Ohio. If somebody were to, in fact, desert, you can't get a pension if you're a deserter, but many deserters got pensions. So you had to apply. And you could have been declared a deserter when your company mustered out because you weren't with the company, but you could have been a POW in the hands of civil authority or in the hands of medical authority. So this is how they deal with that. And these are also in the record and pension office. Another thing you're going to want to look at is the 1890 special census. And when I look at that for Wisconsin, I find my great-great-grandfather, Benjamin Parrish, a corporal in the 13th Wisconsin, living in Sugar Creek. These schedules are found on Ancestry. And you can look at them by county, which is the way I advise you to do it. What I haven't talked about tonight is draft records and provost marshal records. They are filed by the congressional district in 1863 Congress second session, and they are located in the branch archives that service that state. And I also haven't talked about the pension payments and ledgers, just because they're hard to get to, but you can get to them if you are diligent in the National Archives. So, questions?
Thank you very much, Craig. That was jam-packed,
Yeah,
full of stuff. We've already got people in the chat box wanting to watch the video to get things that they missed. I am going to ask about a couple of the things that people have asked. Mostly, what was that book again? one question was, what was the name of the 2 volumes of those blue books? And then there was a second one that said, what is the name of the book that lists the names of Civil War personnel that you referenced on an earlier slide? Those both might be referring to the
two
same
blue
thing.
books are Heitman's Register of U.S. Army Officers, and the first volume contains the names of everybody, but the other volume contains other information regarding the forts, battles, involvement, and things, and that kind of thing. So, I mean, I use both of them all the time. In fact, it's not on this bookshelf. It's at the house. But anyway, I'm not sure. There are books that list all the Confederate and Union soldiers. They're published by Broadfoot, but I did not talk about them because all he did was sit down and copy all the compiled military service stuff. And you might as well go after, for Confederates especially, you might as well go after the compiled military service records. Now, if you can't find a compiled military service record, you could look in Broadfoot, and he may have pulled something out of a hospital record or somewhere else, because you don't have to have a compiled military service record. Remember, they're created by the United States Army 30 years after the war. So they may not have the records.
Okay. Christine, you have your hand raised. If you want to, there you go.
Yeah, so, and certainly for myself and probably other African Americans, had to work in a totally different way. Stories that were passed down to us that people had worked in Civil War, I had to look at people who were in a certain age bracket to see if possibly they could have served. The other thing was in the case of 2 of my great granduncles who actually were honored by the town of Eatonton. Eatonton, North Carolina, they used their slave master's name to join up, which is not the name of our family.
So let me ask.
Uh-huh.
Are you familiar with Crowder patience?
Yes, that is my Crowder and Thomas. Yes.
Crowder and Thomas. I was there for the dedication.
Yeah, so are we.
Yeah. So it was good food in the tent by the church, wasn't it?
Yes.
But Dr. Juanita Patience Moss
is my cousin.
Has written several books on the Civil War.
Yes.
She came to me 30 years ago and said she had a book, and I said, okay. And she did this book on Crowder patience. And it's called Created to be Free.
Yes.
And she learned through researching Crowder that he was not at the Battle of Plymouth, fortunately, but was on Roanoke Island. But she learned a lot about the Battle of Plymouth. So when she'd done that book, I said, what are you going to do next? And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, you know how to write. You got to write another book. So she did a book on the Battle of Plymouth.
Yes.
Which is sold at the Plymouth site. And then when she finished that book, I said, well, what are you going to do now? And she said, what? I said, yeah, you've done 2 books. You got to do another one. So she did 2 books on Blacks in Union regiments.
Yes.
And then she also did a book on uncovering the roots, and through DNA.
Through DNA, that's how, yes.
Thomas's family.
Yes.
Who was not a patient's family. It was it Lawrence?
Lawrence. Yes, that was my grandmother.
Yes. And the Lawrence family
yes.
had never met each other.
Exactly.
All came together in Eatonton last year. I think it was last year. It may have been 18
but
months.
We had been conversing for years.
Yeah.
But we hadn't physically met.
So and she's just been a pleasure to work with. She got King's College in Wilkes-Barre gave her an honorary doctorate.
Yes.
For her work on the Civil War and Blacks. I mean,
now on the other side of where people we were passed down that they might have been involved in the Confederate, not as soldiers, but were taken along. I mean, that is hard to trace.
Yeah,
Looking for
there's-
diaries, looking
Right.
for,
But one place that you can look, there's a book by Renee Ingram called In View of the Great Want of Labor. And what it traces is the Confederate Congress's legal struggle with dealing with African Americans as soldiers in the Confederacy. And what we find is there were recruits in Richmond near the end of the war that were about to become soldiers. But there were also, these were all free blacks. There were also, so there are registers of free blacks and where they're assigned during the war, like the Niter battalions that I was talking about earlier. So they're the registers that are in record group 109, entry number 4, that deals with these group of African Americans who are involved with the Confederacy. Now, because the war ends, nothing comes of it, except for those that are working in the mines, in the salt mines, in the niter mines, and those kind of places, or at the arsenals. So I mean, you're right. There are lots of places that you need to look for African American service. You definitely want to. The U.S. Colored Troop compiled military service records are on Fold 3. Every single state had a U.S. Colored Troops unit. In fact, South Carolina had no white units that served for the Union, but they had a regiment of African Americans in U.S. Colored Troops. So I could probably spend an hour talking about U.S. Colored Troops and African American research related to the Civil War, but I've just never put it together.
yeah, it is, yeah.
Anybody else?
Susan Ogden has her hand raised, but before I get to that, there was a comment in the chat box. I guess it was a question as well. Thanks for the great info. I have been hunting for my great-great-grandfather's records and his supposed brothers, but have had no success. He was Union from New York and later died in, I think, Norfolk, Virginia Veterans Hospital.
Well, I would go to the VA and get the VA record, because the VA record will say what unit he was probably in. And you don't need to, of course, you'll be asked for his service number. You just have to tell him he doesn't have one. But a lot of it has to do with, if he died in a VA hospital, he was living in 1923. So it's also possible that he doesn't have Civil War service, that it's Spanish American War service. So I'm just saying it's possible. But if he's from New York, there's a man by the name of Wirt has written a 2-volume set of New York soldiers in the Civil War that I would look at and see what's there, because it goes beyond compiled military service records.
Okay. I have another question in the chat box, but we'll get to Susan because she had her hand up first, I believe. Susan, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, is he going to show the sword? I have a
Oh.
sword that I've not been able to identify.
I forgot all about it. Let me stop my share.
Oh, I'm so anxious to see it.
Let me see. So if you put it on, if you change your view to who's talking, speaker, you'll get a bigger picture. But anyway, so this is the sword. This hung in my grandfather's house. He told me it was a Civil War sword, and it actually is not. It is, and I've got a YouTube video on this also. It's a Knights of Pythias sword, which was a fraternal organization after the war, created by the clerks of the Record and Pension Office.
Oh,
And they used to have bands and all that kind of stuff. And it's engraved. It's got my W.W.
Oh, yes.
Roberts. That was my, actually, it's R.W. Roberts, not W. W.W. Roberts is my grandfather. R.W. Roberts is his father. His name was Roland Woodson, or no, Roland Woody Roberts. But anyway,
Did the Grand Army, the Republic did in New York, did they have a sword?
well, the officers had swords. I don't know whether it's very possible that if they were in the GAR, they could have a sword. Yes.
Because I have a sword that I have yet to been able to identify. Could I take a
If
picture
you'll
and
send
send
me
it?
if you will send me pictures of it, I will
Okay,
attempt to help you.
thank you very much.
Okay. Deborah, who had the ancestor in from New York who died in Norfolk, said, "Sorry, I missed the name of those records. My great grandfather was in the Civil War. I have a service number, but it comes up invalid. He was in the 161st Infantry."
Okay. So the there are no service numbers in the Civil War, so it might be an account number of some sort, or it might be a pension. It could be his pension certificate number. It could be his pension application number. There are several kinds of things that it could be. I'd love to see the record that it's on, and I'll be happy to help you figure out where that number actually came from. Service records, service numbers don't exist until February, March of 1918 for enlisted men in World War I, and then officers not until 1932.
Okay. Karen, I see you, but I'm finishing with the chat box. Mark says that my great grandfather Junius Person was an officer in the 3rd Virginia Infantry. There is a book by Lee Wallace about the 3rd Virginia. He is buried at Family Church Cemetery with 7 other Civil War soldiers in Southampton County. We just celebrated our 186th year. Any other records about the 3rd Virginia that you can recommend?
Well, Lee Wallace did an excellent job of putting together the regimental books that he did. So I would be looking at Wallace's references in that book and then explore those references. The other thing I would do is collect the maps of the battles that the 3rd was in. So you can put your guy on the ground where the 3rd was. And then if you want to, walk the land. I do that often. Although I do that more with my War of 1812 guys than I do with my Civil War guys. But and my Rev War guys. But I always like to walk the land, but it requires having a map and knowing where they were on the field. And generally, in Civil War battles, you can, in fact, figure out exactly where they were on the field within a couple of 100 yards anyway.
Okay. Karen, you're muted. She's working on it. There you go.
Okay. Yep. Okay. My Civil War soldier, he was incarcerated in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And the story goes that he had killed an officer from the Army. Which Army, Confederate or Union, it's not told, but he was given an order. So he was a cavalry person, and apparently the cavalry, they hang you apparently if if you do something bad enough. But at the Army, they shoot you. And basically he took his sword and he killed him with his sword. That's the story I'm told. He killed this guy, they sent him off to Leavenworth. And when he was there, he had some kind of skin disease for a little while. And then this is right before the war ends. And he was up for court martial. And then when he doesn't come home until a full year after the war is over. And there were 2 books regarding, this is the 21st Regiment of New York, and they went on to do some Indian wars, I believe, after probably he was deposited in Kansas, to be put in jail. And he was there for several months apparently, and then he doesn't get actually released until 1866.
So
So,
he's not going to end up in Leavenworth prison before a court martial. He may have been court martialed twice, but
oh,
so have you send me an email with his name and unit and the time
okay.
frame, and I'll see what the court martial number is so you can order the court martial from the
Okay.
National Archives. Okay.
Because I would really like to know what
He killed a Confederate
did.
officer in first of all, Leavenworth is far afield from where the battles are actually being fought.
That's right.
So I think that he was probably court-martialed somewhere else. I don't know of any New York regiments that ended up that far west.
Yeah.
So I don't
Could
think
he-
any New York regiments went west to fight Indians.
Mhm.
However, there were Confederates who
Craig,
went west to fight. Yes.
could he have been sent out to Leavenworth with the galvanized Yankees?
No, he probably wouldn't be if he was with the 21st New York.
Because my husband's got a galvanized Yankee that's at
Yep.
Leavenworth.
The galvanized Yankees that end up at Leavenworth are basically those who come out of Rock Island and Camp Chase and who join
Okay.
those 6 regiments.
Mhm.
The compiled military service records for those are on fold 3.
And
Okay.
if they're sneaky and they get pensions.
Well, because they ended the war as Union soldiers.
Hmm.
It's how you
But
ended
they
the
kept-
war, how you got at your pension.
But they kept cutting him off. The pension's about 1.5 feet high.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
Well,
You've
my
got my
guy
address,
got a
so you
pension.
can send me. You've got my email address, so you can send me the information
Okay.
on it. I'll look in the court martial index and see if I can find anything.
Okay.
Um,
That'd be great.
it-
Thank you.
if he would have killed a Union, if he was a Union soldier who killed a Union officer, he would not have come home.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's my feeling too.
All right.
I'm just going by what family Laura has told me.
I was about to mention the SB file. The SB file is a list of executions on the part of the federal government or state governments since the colonial period, ESPY.
Okay.
But he didn't die that way.
Right. No.
So he's not going to be in the SB file. But I have a copy of the SB file in my references. So I'm always looking for individuals who were executed for one reason or another.
No, he does have a pension file, and he did receive his widow received a pension up until she died as well.
Okay, I would also look in the Record and Pension Office Index on Ancestry then.
Okay, pension. Say that again. Pension what?
Record and Pension. Index to the correspondence of the Record and Pension Office. It's on Ancestry. Just
Okay.
type in Pension Office.
Okay, got it. All right.
Okay?
Yep, great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Christy asks, where or how can I find records for patients in the Stanton General Hospital for Wounded Soldiers for the Battle of Piedmont, June 1864?
I would first look in the preliminary inventory of the War Department collection of Confederate records. I once had somebody come to me and say, I'm looking for somebody who was in a hospital in Charlottesville. And she said she couldn't find him. And I said, where'd you look? And she said, well, I looked everywhere. I said, no, where? She said she looked at all the records. And if you tell me you've looked at all the records, I know you didn't. No, I said, no, what'd you look at? She said, I looked at the microfilm. Well, I knew those records weren't on microfilm. So I went to the preliminary inventory and it said Charlottesville register 1861, 1865, surgeon, his name was Cabell, and he kept the register the entire time. And it had name, rank, disposition, unit, all that kind of stuff. Then I went to that guide that has John Wilkes Booth picture on the front of it. And it told me that the hospital was located on the grounds of the University of Virginia. So there's more information. So if the finding aid, the preliminary inventory doesn't tell you about Stanton Hospital, go to that other guide and see if Stanton Hospital is mentioned there.
Okay.
And also,
Go ahead.
the Augusta County Historical Society probably knows those records, for all we know, could be in the Augusta County Historical Society.
Excellent. Okay, Anne says, my husband was going through things from his parents and just found a medallion for the Knights of Pythias that belonged to his grandfather. We had no idea he belonged to that organization. Where can we find more information?
Wikipedia? No, I mean that's basically where I started my search for the Knights of Pythias, was right there, and then just go after the references. I mean, it doesn't exist anymore. And because it was a private fraternal organization, the records are at the, the four winds, because they're in personal hands. So you could, if you can figure out what, and I don't know what they called them, because each fraternal organization has their own way of describing their conclaves, their units, their troops, their camps, I don't know what they called them in the Knights of Pythias. I do know the Knights of Pythias had a band. And the medallion that you have might very well be a cap device.
Oh, she's holding it up.
Oh,
Hold on.
I can't see.
Hold on, let me spotlight it.
That is a fob.
Okay.
You know what I mean by a fob?
For a watch?
No, but
Oh.
used the same way.
Okay.
In that it would go into his watch pocket. That the circle would go into the watch pocket, and then the other end would be attached. Yeah, that would go in the watch pocket, and then the other end would be attached to his shirt. A buttonhole.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks very much.
Okay, I've
I would
love
I would love to have an image of that if you don't mind sharing it.
I'll be happy to.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, and the last one from Jacob, although I'm not sure if this is just a statement or a question, but I will read it because he sent it privately and y'all can't see it. I'm from Waverly, Kentucky, where St. Vincent Academy used to be a Catholic high school at one time. During the Civil War, both sides were treated at a hospital associated with the school. The school operated until 1967. Waverly is east of Paducah, Kentucky, and just south of Evansville, Indiana.
Okay, my recommendation would be that if the school was used as a hospital by the Union Army, there would be damage to the school. Not part of the Southern Claims Commission, but part of a claims commission, maybe the Canby Commission, but there were several claims commissions after the war. Look for Baker Turner. That's the one it probably is in, where the school could apply to the federal government for reimbursement for damages done. Let me tell you a story. In Loudoun County, there's a Baptist church that was used as a hospital. All of the pews were, according to the historians of Loudoun County, were used for firewood. I said, they were used for caskets. So this is why I became a Revolutionary War and War of 1812 expert rather than a Civil War expert in Loudoun County, because they said, oh no, and they pretty much ignored me. So I went and found the Baptist Church's claim in the Baker Turner records. And in the claim specifically, it said they used the pews for coffins. So I was and then they got paid, and, so I tracked it all down, and, so anyway, it was just very gratifying to know that I was right. In fact, nobody's going to waste good wood from pews on firewood when there's got fence posts all around them that are weathered and dry and all that kind of stuff. But to make coffins, it's easy to make a coffin out of a pew.
Oh, wait, one more. Oh, he just said thank you. As did other people. Lots of people said thank you for. Anne says that she's going to be at this Latin lecture, so she's going to bring the fob and show it to you in person.
Oh, thank you.
And that's
Do you have a picture of your guy too?
you're
Yeah.
muted, but she's nodding. So
Yeah. I mean, I would love to do a follow-on YouTube video of my Knights of Pythias to show another accoutrement of the Knights of Pythias, because I'm looking for a band cap now because they had bands.
Okay.
Anyway, thank
All
you.
right. Well, that is it. Thank you very much.
So
we
I'm
had
doing,
lots of.
I'm
Go ahead.
talking about the Slatin lectures. Do you all know about those?
Yes, please, please. I was about to mention that, but please go ahead.
Well, I'm looking for my list of what lectures I'm giving, and I don't see it on my desk here somewhere. I know I'm doing Rev War, road orders, something else. It was here on my desk earlier. Huh. I don't know. But anyway, there is a brochure. The lecture is not this Saturday, but next Saturday. It's all day, 4 lectures at the Library of Virginia.
Hang on a second. I will post a link.
Greg, it's researching your French and Indian War ancestor, researching Rev War ancestor, a case study, loyalists of the American Revolution, and Virginia road orders.
Okay.
And anyone who gets the blast from GRIVA got the registration form on Sunday.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I've never been a Slatin lecturer before.
Oh, good.
So it's a first for me, and I'm, and
My
those are
time.
all of those things are at least 3 out of 4 of those are favorite topics that I could talk about in my sleep. The road orders one I can't really talk about in my sleep, but I know road orders. So since we publish all the Virginia road orders except for one county, Orange.
Gotcha. And I did post a link in the chat box to the Friends of Virginia Archives website that is sponsoring said Slatin lectures, and you can get information on joining there if you didn't get the GRIVA email. So, did get a question about the recording of this lecture. It will be on GRIVA's YouTube channel by tomorrow, and we will also post a link on our website sometime later tomorrow. I'll also post a link to it on Facebook. So thank you very much. Getting lots of thanks, and thank you, and thanks for a great presentation, very informative, and lots of positive comments in the chat box. So I will pass that on for everybody and just say thank you to everybody for attending, and thanks, Craig, for a great lecture.
Sure. Have a good one.
Good night, Good night.